All right, last try here. That takes us really to the end of the Frank and April Wheeler story. They certainly affect other people, and really, I mean, people in the crowd were sort of the stars of the crowd. The first chapter of the book, we don't really see anything other than from their point of view. We don't really know who they are. We're seeing them through other people's eyes. And the last chapter of the book, we're seeing them now and their death. And Frank sort of changed through other people's eyes. And we open up with Millie Campbell, who's telling this story many, many times in the following month, and says, it was, everything worked out well, all things considered, considering how horrible it was, which is sort of a strange way of putting things. And Shep agrees, and he has a role, and that just tells us that he's acting. He's aware of it, but he does play that role. And here we have sort of a nice sort of offshoot of those wonderful things we talked about in Tim O'Brien, and the way he lets stories lift us up, and a way that he has stories that keep the dead alive, and stories that help us. We tell these stories to find our own truth. He told these stories over and over and over so he could find his own truth about Kurt Lemon's death, or Norman Bowker's death, or Kiowa's death. Here, we have something that's not that. We have a story that's being retold over and over without any will to or want to change it. It's less a story than it is a act. In other words, maybe it was a story the first time, yet instead of retelling it in a way that you try to gain some further understanding, for example, in Sweetheart of the Song Trayvon, Kylie tells this story, and he's interacting with the people he's telling with, to the annoyance of Dave Jensen at a point. It was like, you're not telling the fucking story right. Kylie is seeking something out of telling that story, and we're not getting that from the Campbells, or at least Millie. Millie is it's a way of comforting herself, but it's also not a way of seeing the truth of what happened here on Revolutionary Road. And even Misgivings, and somebody wrote, maybe a couple of you in your Moodle response, about what a great character she turned out to be. And you're right. I mean, really the saddest character in some ways. And a low battery. And in other ways, at the same time, just as sort of unwilling to confront the harshness. Millie Campbell comforts herself with a story. Eventually, Shep Campbell comforts himself by leaving the room and getting himself a drink, crying a little bit. And Misgivings comforts herself with a puppy dog. Classic. I bet that puppy dog is the most spoiled friggin' puppy dog in the neighborhood. Anyway, Shep is listening to her tell this story over and over and over, playing a role. And he's sick of it finally one night when she's telling it to the people who've moved into the Wheeler's house. A young couple, last name of Brace, very nice contrast to Wheeler. There's even points in the story where Frank and April both say they're trying to brace themselves. And he looks over and he sees Millie is enjoying telling the story. And there's a sense of trashiness to it. And I don't think it's beneath any of us. I think we all can kind of succumb to that moment, that sort of, that sort of need to just sort of be comforted by the same. But you're not finding out any truth. That's certainly not the storytelling that Tim O'Brien's talking about. Whatever the case, she's just on and on and on. We're out of our minds. And we kind of get some filled in terms of what happened with Frank. And it's just, this is one of the most hard. I'm glad I'm sort of being interrupted here. But glad my kids are in the next room, because that scene wherever they're asking if the mom's going to pick them up, and that sort of thing. And then they called the hospital. Frank had just left, doing the stuff that you do when somebody dies. And then, anyway, he called his brother in Pittsburgh. And then he comes and picks up the kids, and he takes them to dinner, and the kids come back, and the little girl still can't process it yet. And so she puts these two things on sort of equal footing. My mommy's in heaven, and we had dinner in a restaurant. And that is just absolutely, that guts me every time I read it. God, said Nancy Brace, but how did things work out finally? She's sharp-faced, bespectacled. She liked her stories neat with points, and she clearly felt there were too many loose ends in this one. Well, good luck with life. Did the relatives stay for a while? Oh no. Right after the funeral, they took the kids back up to Pittsfield. Frank went along for a few days to help, and then moved to the city, started going up there for the weekends, and that's the way things are now. So Frank gives up the kids. Frank barely sees the kids, sees them on weekends maybe, and he's just gone to work, doing his job, and probably doing his job well. And then we didn't see anything more of Frank until after March, whenever it was. He came out to see the closing of the house. He spent a couple days with us. And then the Braces don't know what to say, so they use one of those stupid phrases that people tend to use whenever they don't know what else to say. They say, it really makes you stop and think. Yeah. How did he seem otherwise? I mean, did it seem to have made fairly good adjustment? He lost a lot of weight. He looked good except for that. He'd been in psychoanalysis, so Frank's the one who ended up going to therapy. He still works for Knox, and it's called Bart Pollock Associates. So he's found himself, really. He's found his calling, and it doesn't matter now. And you got to think that green light is gone for Frank. He never hears April's voice anymore. Anyway, he keeps busy. He's courageous. And then Shep just says, I'm going to refill your drinks, and leaves. He can't take it anymore. Why does she have to make such a soap opera out of it? Courageous. How could a man be courageous when he wasn't even alive? And then he remembers Frank that afternoon, just how mild and flat. He was not the same person. Just that description from Shep. He was boring, talked about his job, my analyst this, my analyst that. Shep takes a gulp of whiskey, and before he knows it, he's crying. And maybe it's the spring air, because that spring was whenever this stuff happened with the Laurel Players. And he remembers April's voice. He found it so easy and pleasant to cry that he didn't try to stop for a while until he realized he was forcing his sobs a little, exaggerating their depths with unnecessary shudders. And ashamed of himself, he realizes that even in his crying, he's starting to turn it into an act, which is funny. It's something. I mean, it's human. It's certainly something you see in maybe your kids occasionally. Your kids will cry, and they've made the most of it, and then they realize they're sort of stopped, so they need to keep it up. As Shep says, the whole point of crying was to quit before you cornered it up. The whole point of grief itself was to cut it out while it was still honest, while it still meant something. The thing was so easily corrupted. Let yourself go. You started embellishing your own sobs. You started telling it about the Wheelers with a sad, sentimental smile, and saying Frank was courageous. Anyway, he gets back in, and, Millie says, it has sort of made us closer. And he says, that's right. And then he thinks about it. Maybe it has. The final scene of the book, which my book is falling apart on me. The last even the pages is falling off. But we see Miss Gibbons go home. She's resigned to the fact that John is going to be where he is. And she's gotten herself a puppy. And she has this big, long story about how great a couple the Braces are, which is exactly the same thing she said about the Wheelers. And, she's not telling herself the truth either. But her husband's not going to listen to it, because the last image of the book is him turning off that hearing aid. So, Gatsby, the final line in Gatsby is, born ceaselessly into the past, and all that wonderful long passage. And I think it's interesting that the Yeats final line of his book is just something as simple as somebody turning off the noise. I said I'd mention it, and I think it speaks to kind of maybe the just how powerful this book is, and just how hard to duplicate it is, and just how scary the thesis of the book is the movie version, which again, like I said, I don't think it's very good. I think the actors are great actors. They're talented. There are some good scenes, but it's simply because they're good scenes anyway. But the end of the book, there's a huge change. And the change is that whenever Millie's telling this story, Shep's still getting irritated by it, but we find out that Frank did not give his kids to his brother. In fact, he's kept the kids, and that's the thing that's really kind of kept him going. He hasn't lost himself in his work. He's just kind of become a better father. Which, again, having read the book, that might as well be Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter in terms of fantasy. But it's almost as if the filmmakers themselves were petrified of the idea of the hopeless emptiness. They could give us just enough of the emptiness and make it seem kind of hopeless, but at the end, they didn't want people leaving the theater thinking there's no hope. I think that's a really, really good metaphor for why this book's so powerful, because it doesn't give you an out with that. And it doesn't let off the ignition or the gas pedal when it just comes to just straight in, diving into that hopeless emptiness. So even the movie fails in that way. It's kind of interesting that they chose it, because as if that, and even then you start to piece it together, like, okay, so that makes everything better, despite the fact that it's totally implausible. But nevertheless, we have finished Revolutionary Road. I've never experienced anything like that's gone on for the 3 weeks, I guess, since we started it to now. Never expected I'd be finishing it like this, but I'm glad you finished it nonetheless. And a lot of you really, really seem to be connecting with it and writing some really good stuff about it. So I'll mention all this again if you don't watch all the way through on YouTube. But the papers for this will be due a week from Monday. Same thing as before. I'll give you the format and all that stuff in terms of how to turn it in, just to make it easier for me to read. But you are welcome to use anything you've already written as a sort of a starting point on the Moodle discussion. But I hope you loved it. For those of you who like Richard Yates and are thinking about maybe using him for your last paper, I would recommend highly his book called The Easter Parade, which is in some ways just as searing, maybe even more in a sense. It's shorter though, and it takes place over a longer period of time. And this book takes place over 3 months. And Easter Parade, I believe, takes place over about 60 to 70 years. Lives of two sisters, just beautifully, beautifully told. For those of you who don't want to go down the rabbit hole of depression like that, but still like Richard Yates, he has a very good book called A Good School. It's a sort of a coming of age book of young man in a sort of dormitory school, and very much I like it better than Catcher in the Rye. It hits on all those things of Catcher in the Rye, but doesn't seem as, I don't know, affected really as that. He's also got a very good collection of short stories. He's got a book called A Special Providence that the first 50 pages are knockout, and then it sort of falls apart. And then he's got some books that just didn't work, like that almost seem like pale imitations of Richard Yates. Of course, that's going through personal stuff as that's going on. But I hope you enjoyed. Glad you enjoyed. I think it's a book you gotta share with anybody who loves literature, but you also gotta warn them. But you also kind of gotta let them find out what they're being warned about on their own. Meanwhile, take care of yourselves, and we're going to start Alice Munro on Monday. The first story you're going to read from Alice Munro is a story called Miles City, Montana. All right. Everything else I give to you on Moodle or through the GroupMe. Have a good one.